dedicated to sharing value by exploring the best books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally here with Book Talk. Today, we're diving into the book, The Art of Dramatic Writing. This is a renowned classic discussing screenwriting methods. Famed director Woody Allen praised it, saying, "I've always believed this is the unrivaled masterpiece among all screenwriting guides." The author is Lajos Egri, a screenwriter and director. Egri founded the first screenwriting school in Hollywood during the 1930s. Woody Allen was one of his students. His single quote, "The Art of Dramatic Writing," was written in 1943 and became a hit in the 1950s, treasured as a pocket guide by Hollywood writers and directors. Right.
It's still a required textbook in major U.S. film schools today.
In Egri's view, writing a great play isn't about sudden inspiration, but following key principles. This applies whether it's ancient Greek tragedy or newer forms like spoken drama, stage plays, or movies. These principles center on three parts: premise, character, and conflict. Egri also challenged Aristotle's idea that plot comes first. Aristotle thought a key feature of ancient Greek tragedy was that plot mattered more than character.
Plot advancement is primary, with characters serving as tools to carry it.
But Egri's view flipped that. He argued characters drive plot and conflict, making them more important.
The book spans 260,000 words across 4 chapters.
Egri uses plays by Shakespeare, Ibsen, and others to show how to design premise, character, and conflict and weave them into a great play. Tony Award winner Gilbert Miller said in the preface, "This book helped me spot bad plays, avoiding costly contracts and clueless set building." But it's more than a manual. It helps everyone grasp why some stories are dull while others shine, which is its true magic. We'll now break down the book through its 3 core parts: premise, character, and conflict. Part 1. First, let's cover premise, which is basically the purpose or spark behind the creation. We often refer to the premise as the central theme, like jealousy leads to destruction, bad temper leads to isolation, vanity leads to poverty. The premise is the core that drives everything to completion. A complete premise is usually a subject-verb-object phrase, where the subject corresponds to character, the verb to conflict, and the object to climax. For example, vanity leads to poverty. Vanity corresponds to a vain character, and leads to corresponds to the conflict that will occur. And poverty is the outcome, which includes the climax. Only with these 3 elements included can you write with purpose. A good premise must also be clear and straightforward to resonate with a wider audience. And you might think that vanity leads to poverty, jealousy leads to destruction. Isn't such a premise too simple? Straightforward, even a bit cliched, but many timeless great plays have premises this simple. For example, as mentioned earlier, vanity leads to poverty is the premise of Maupassant's famous novel, The Necklace. In this story, the vain heroine Mathilde loses a pearl necklace she borrowed from a friend and spends 10 years scrimping and working to repay it, only to find out it was fake. And it's not a complex story, but it still resonates today, making us reflect on vain people around us. Shakespeare's famous play, Romeo and Juliet, also has a simple premise. Great love transcends death. 2 young lovers, unable to be together due to family feud, ultimately both die. Everything in this story revolves around the premise of love and death. Of course, the premise that great love transcends death doesn't necessarily end with the protagonist's death.
But in Shakespeare's story, Romeo and Juliet have no room for compromise. They're willing to give up eloping and lose their lives.
That's the premise of this play, using death to prove the sincerity of love. Now we know what a good premise is. So how do we approach a good premise and write it? Here we'll focus on 3 suggestions. First, choose a basic human emotion as the entry point, then deepen and intensify that emotional trait. For example, if you're writing about love, you should write about great love. If it's ambition, it should be ruthless ambition.
If it's care, it should be care under possessiveness.
Why do these emotions seem so negative and pessimistic?
Because such emotions are more thrilling. Take ambition as an example. What makes it cruel ambition? For instance, in Shakespeare's King Lear, the whole play features one after another. Fathers killing sons, sisters fighting sisters, wives killing husbands, daughters betraying fathers.
One chain reaction after another. You'll notice that violence among blood relatives has a different impact than among strangers. Ambition within family conflicts is more brutal and more gripping. And now the second point about approaching a premise is to write one you truly believe in. Otherwise, it'll be hard to consistently carry it through. A premise doesn't have to be a universal truth, but it should be a hypothesis based on the author's stance or values, because without a stance, there is no drama. For example, as mentioned earlier, love can transcend death isn't a truth. A playwright could set the premise as, no matter how great love is, it can't conquer death, which might lead to a play about love retreating before death. If the playwright believes in this premise, they can still write it in a thought-provoking way. And therefore, when the premise is an important idea that the playwright must express, the play becomes easier to write. The third suggestion about a premise is that it shouldn't be too obvious. In other words, you don't need to highlight the theme everywhere in the play. The premise doesn't have to appear in dialogue, but it should be implicitly understood by the audience. Otherwise, characters become puppets, and the drama turns preachy, failing to move people.
Imagine if Romeo kept saying all day, "Great love transcends death, I'll die for love." Wouldn't that feel out of place?
If in the novel The Necklace, a character kept popping up to nag about how vanity leads to poverty, otherwise, Mathilda's story would just become pure preachiness. In a well-constructed story, the premise and plot are blended seamlessly and harmoniously, like mixing flour and water into dough. There are no clear boundaries between them. Now we've covered the premise. It's the purpose and starting point of creation. Once we've established the premise, we need to prove it. For example, if you set the premise as great love transcends death,
Then the story that follows must make people believe that love truly can transcend death. Otherwise, the audience will either think you've gone off topic or that the play is illogical and unconvincing.
but how do we prove something intangible like a premise? The author Egri believes we prove it through the character's actions and choices. Next, in part 2, we'll discuss characters. A play usually has two main characters, one of whom is the driving character. The driving character is the lead who creates conflict and propels the drama forward.
Generally equivalent to what we call the protagonist. A strong driving character must have urgent goals, like revenge, gaining honor, or fulfilling ambition. This goal matters more than anything else in their life.
Take Shakespeare's Hamlet. The entire play is driven by his inner struggles and choices.
Grappling with to be or not to be, he chooses revenge, schemes relentlessly, alters his mother and lover's fates, and dies poisoned.
Opposing the driving character is the antagonist who blocks their goals. In Hamlet, that's his uncle, Claudius. Claudius kills his own brother for power, marries the queen, and seizes the throne. To cover his crime, he plots to kill Hamlet while manipulating public opinion. Egri argues antagonists must use all their power and cunning to obstruct the protagonist. In other words, they must be evenly matched for compelling conflict. Claudius matches Hamlet's strength, using every scheme to kill him. When one plot fails, he tries another, but karma prevails. Hamlet stabs him, though both die poisoned. Notably, today we consider the driving character the main protagonist, the lead. But Western dramaturgy debates this. Egri argues Othello's driving character isn't Othello, but the villain Iago. Iago, jealous and resentful for being passed over, poisons Othello against his wife Desdemona, driving him to kill her before Othello learns the truth and suicides. In this play, all the plot is driven by Iago, making him the driving character, while the powerful Othello prevents Iago from confronting him directly and even threatens Iago's life. And so, thus Othello is the antagonist. Similarly, in Ibsen's Doll's House, the driving character isn't Nora, but a moneylender named Krogstad. Igri argues that after Krogstad was fired by Nora's husband, his quest to restore his reputation triggered actions leading to Nora's marital breakdown and departure. Actually, today, antagonistic figures like Iago and Krogstad are often called catalysts, a more intriguing term. But regardless of whether the driving character is the protagonist, they must powerfully propel the plot. There's no disagreement in theater circles on this point. And during this, you might ask, must every play have a driving character and an antagonist? The book doesn't answer this question, but in many postmodern and post-structuralist plays, clear opposing forces are absent, reflecting shifts in European social thought since the late 19th century. A wave of decentering logic swept humanities' fields, and theater couldn't escape this influence. Take Beckett's masterpiece, Waiting for Godot. Two tramps wait beneath a tree for Godot, rambling endlessly while he never arrives. These tramps can't even be called driving characters, they merely talk and wait. Beckett's premise reveals life as endless waiting. Yet, in classical dramatic structure, driving characters and antagonists remain essential, foundational to all theater and Hollywood's narrative DNA. Pre-First Industrial Evolution, European antagonists were often villains, but modernity introduced morally gray conflicts where ordinary people, driven by self-interest, clash with protagonists, reflecting the petty bourgeoisie's rise. The literary and artistic fields are beginning to focus on real issues in capitalist development. For instance, in A Doll's House, the heroine Nora's opponent is her husband, Helmer. But Helmer isn't a bad person. Earlier we mentioned that, according to the book, the driving character in A Doll's House is the moneylender, Krogstad. But by modern standards, we still define the driving character as Nora in this play. We'll analyze this more later. So far, we know a play must have two key characters, the driving character and the antagonist. Besides these two main roles, there are many supporting characters in a play. How do we shape them and tie them to the premise?
Let's start with common human traits. Egri divides shared characteristics into 3 dimensions: physiological, psychological, and social, each shaping personality and behavior.
Among these, the physiological dimension is the most obvious physical traits, which can make us biased or generous, humble or arrogant. Illnesses, especially chronic ones, sway mindset, impact psychological growth, and drive actions. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the bell ringer Quasimodo is a hunchback, a monster forsaken by God. He silently admires the gypsy girl Esmeralda, but when facing his beloved, Quasimodo feels inferior and can only protect her secretly. Only when Esmeralda is sent to the gallows does Quasimodo, unable to bear it, step forward publicly to try and protect her. If Quasimodo were a handsome, normal person, his story with Esmeralda might have started openly, reflecting human commonalities. The second dimension is the social dimension. Was this character born in a slum or a bustling city? What's their education level? Who are their parents and friends? Do they attend church? And so on. Someone born humble and someone raised in privilege are definitely not the same kind of person. The third dimension is the psychological dimension, a product of the previous two, interacting to produce psychological states like temperament, ambitions, emotions, etc. Therefore, the psychological dimension reflects the above two dimensions. At every stage of life, a person's behavior results from the combined influence of these 3 dimensions. Only by understanding these 3 dimensions of your character can you write a logical, convincing persona. Egri believed that if a character is believable, they can drive the play's development themselves. Since compelling characters are so vital, what should be our starting point for writing them? In modern terms, this means establishing your character's persona firmly before developing them, then conceptualizing their 3 dimensions,
And the character could be an ordinary person from reality, based on a prototype or entirely fictional, but must amplify their most prominent traits and incorporate contrasts. For instance, if writing about clumsiness, avoid conventional choices. Instead, create a beautiful yet awkward woman.
Similarly, someone with congenital flaws becomes more intriguing when wealthy rather than poor.
Even with innate disadvantages, high social status invites insincere flattery from others. This leads to unexpected downfalls where irony from contrasts proves deeper than perpetual tragedy. If one person has multiple standout traits, each could spawn a distinct character. Suddenly, you have endless characters to explore. Having covered the 3 dimensions and character creation, these focus on individual development. Next, we need these characters to interact within the script. This introduces the concept of orchestration. Simply put, orchestration is how you assemble individual characters. 19th century Norwegian playwright Ibsen once said, "Writing requires solitude, but with 8 characters, I have a whole society keeping me busy." Ibsen also mandated 3 distinctly contrasting characters per play, not limiting to 3, but preventing uniform personalities. For example, in Don Quixote, if Sancho were also a dream-driven tragic hero like Quixote, their aligned views would eliminate conflict, draining the novel's tension. A play can feature identical roles, 2 con artists, 2 sex workers, 2 thieves, but must ensure differentiation.
But they must differ in temperament, outlook on life, and communication style.
For instance, one is warm-hearted while the other is cold-blooded. Only then can friction arise, sparking dramatic developments. Ibsen's demonstrates masterful character orchestration. Nora is a cautious, indecisive, yet kind-hearted housewife, the opposing character. Helmer is a husband obsessed with saving face, domineering and controlling. To fund Helmer's medical treatment, Nora independently borrowed money from his subordinate Krogstad, secretly forging her husband's signature, unintentionally committing document forgery. Years later, when Helmer became manager and fired Krogstad, the latter blackmailed Nora using the forged document. Upon discovering this, Helmer flew into a rage, calling Nora wicked, criminal, and lowly.
Saying she'd ruined all his prospects.
Realizing her subordinate role in the family, Nora resolutely left. If Nora were merely gentle and Helmer domineering, that wouldn't suffice. Ibsen's genius lies in crafting Helmer as meticulous and conscientious. While Nora has minor flaws, childishly deceitful and scheming, yet careless enough to get caught, neither meant harm. They loved each other initially, but their diametrically opposed personalities, forced into one household, created perfect drama. Beyond orchestration, unity of opposites is essential. What is unity of opposites? Simply put, irreconcilable from start to finish. Egri considered it most awkward when conflict suddenly stalls mid-play. That only shows the driving and opposing characters' conflict lacks depth. Take Helmer and Nora, family bound by Helmer's medical needs and household maintenance, unable to easily separate, yet opposing in how to sustain the family. Thus, achieving unity between them is agonizing, but only such entangled conflict is Shingseda. Why Shingseda will inherit? Otherwise, why watch easily resolved disputes? Had Helmer's love for Nora outweighed his pride, he'd have compromised. But Helmer remained unchanged, so their conflict escalated until the climactic rupture. Having covered this, we've pretty much discussed the character part. Egri once said, "A play grows from its characters. Their personalities and choices drive the plot's development." Here, he also overturns Aristotle's view that plot is primary. In his literary work, Poetics, Aristotle analyzed ancient Greek tragedy in detail, arguing that characters are mere appendages to action. In ancient Greek tragedy, characters often must follow fate. When the gods speak, humans can only live or die according to divine decree. Thus, characters merely act according to their predetermined roles. Take the famous ancient Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex. Oedipus received an oracle at birth predicting he would kill his father and marry his mother, so he was exiled to the wilderness, severing ties with his homeland. But as an adult,
He unknowingly killed his father in disguise and married his mother. Although Oedipus spent his life fleeing this prophecy, he still couldn't escape fate's grasp. But Egri believes that characters' personalities and actions create different destinies. Well-crafted characters are what make a play work. If Romeo weren't impulsive and reckless, but melancholic and introspective like Hamlet, then, after falling in love with Juliet, he might deliver a flowery monologue or try to reconcile with her family. Meanwhile, Juliet might never know Romeo loved her, marrying someone else, leading to a completely different ending.
Similarly, if Hamlet were a power-hungry prince, would he still avenge his father's death?
With the development of dramaturgy theory, Egri's character first perspective has now become mainstream. All right, having covered the principles of character building, we now move to the core part of a play, which is what this book discusses. Thirdly, what is the main conflict about? In modern drama or film, we see conflicts between people and environment, and within oneself. The conflict this book addresses is that defined by classical drama, the conflict between the driving character and the antagonist. Once a play has characters, it has desires and actions, hence conflict. Conflict can stem from a small incident. It doesn't necessarily start as a specific conflict with someone. Egri gives an example in the book. Imagine you're a young man who meets an upper-class girl at a dance, utterly smitten. You finally muster courage to invite her to a movie, seemingly the start of a love story. But you're poor. Most earnings support your family, leaving you unable to afford date clothes. This shatters confidence in pursuing her. You skip the date, sinking into gloom. That negativity causes work mistakes, costing your job. Thus, a simple invitation spirals into life-altering conflict.
The youth might turn to crime for money, then obsessively pursue the girl.
If she rejects him, they could plunge into chaotic entanglement and conflict. This drama isn't rare in modern crime stories. From this example, we see how resolve, problem-solving, vision, and approach steer conflict's trajectory. When a character has fierce resolve, it awakens forces that trigger opposing obstacles. Had he loved her less, poverty wouldn't torment him, nor drive further action. Conflict is truly omnipresent. Just observe those around us. Traits like greed, arrogance, cowardice, cunning, or loyalty, intelligence, nobility. All such traits breed conflict, even between atheists and devout believers. Having covered conflict's origins, let's discuss its types. In drama, conflict falls into three categories: static, jumping, and slowly escalating. First, static conflict remains stagnant, no progression or deepening, essentially deadlock. Back to our story. If the youth is cowardly, he invites her, then hesitates and cancels. This plot would manifest static conflict, painfully slow and likely dull. In such cases, playwrights should avoid it. This character isn't mature enough to sustain a prolonged, escalating conflict. Take another example. A woman feels her life is stagnant. Though she weeps bitterly, she only paces the room without taking action. Then she too is a static character. Worry and sorrow alone can't create conflict. We need conscious will to solve problems, breaking static deadlock through action, to generate conflict that drives the play toward its premise. Now, the second conflict type, jumping conflict. Suppose our young man, though poor, has always been law-abiding. One day, he suddenly decides to mug someone on the street over clothes money. This is jumping conflict. Unlike static conflict, jumping involves action and triggers chain reactions. For instance, his victim resists fiercely during the mugging. In the struggle, he shoves the victim down, causing critical injury and coma. Panicked, he compounds errors, accidentally killing a pursuing officer, etc. But a law-abiding youth suddenly turning robber is inherently implausible. Thus, jumping conflict is flawed and should be avoided. A city's people don't become thieves overnight. A sane woman wouldn't impulsively abandon her home either. Unless she'd planned it, static and jumping conflicts, both non-ideal, should be minimized. The third type, slowly escalating conflict, is what we need. It organically unifies strong orchestration, clear premise, and dimensional characters.
Every well-crafted play features interlocking minor conflicts throughout.
We call these small conflicts transitions, and they shift characters' mental states until decisive actions propel the climax. Through these transitions, characters develop at varying paces. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, Romeo's inner turmoil upon learning his crush is from his family's enemy is such a minor conflict. What we want to create is gradual character development. We'd rather see how an upright person with noble sentiments gets torn apart step by society and environment, or how a villain gradually awakens and makes the right choice, not sudden transformations. A villain instantly becoming good or a good person turning bad overnight. Drama isn't a copy of life, but a distillation of it. To write a deeply resonant story, playwrights must refine the factors that escalate conflict and make it plausible. Quote, "The war, not roller coaster like plot jumps. Only escalating conflicts reveal characters' hidden emotions, driving forces, current stances, and future trajectories." As Egri put it, slowly escalating conflicts ensure crisis and climax. When conflict reaches a tipping point, it forms the dramatic turning point, the crisis. And the resolution is the climax. Let's revisit A Doll's House to explain crisis and climax. In the story, Krogstad, the moneylender working under Helmer, gets fired by Helmer, so he threatens Nora. Persuade Helmer to reinstate him, or he'll expose the forged signature. He says, "If someone pushes me back into the gutter, I'll take you down with me." But what does Helmer tell Nora?
He says, "I tell you, I absolutely cannot work with such a man. Seeing him makes my skin crawl."
Thus, Nora gets trapped in the middle. Crisis looms. This crisis foreshadows Homer learning the truth. Krogstad, once dismissed, Krogstad will retaliate, ultimately causing the image-obsessed Helmer to break with Nora. After the crisis, what is the climax? The climax is Nora's awakening, realizing her fears and efforts were in vain. To her husband, she's just a puppet, so she rebels and leaves desperately. Thus, we've outlined a play's three essentials: premise, character, and conflict. In the book's final section, Egri adds minor techniques playwrights should note. Here, we'll focus on crafting character dialogue, because in a play, dialogue runs throughout and dominates. Dialogue's first function is informing the audience of events.
Second, it reveals characters' personalities and conflicts between them.
Third, it embodies the premise and executes conflict. For playwrights, we first need dialogue that sparks conflict.
In Egri's view, popular sitcoms on TV are filled with conflict-free dialogue, shallow, static, with no decisive winner.
You deliver a witty line. I top it with a wittier one.
Both parties emerge unscathed. Characters lack defined conflicts or personalities, just idle chatter. This might be fine for laugh-driven sitcoms.
But in story scripts, avoid such dialogue.
Second, dialogue must clearly and logically reflect a character's habitual language to accurately reveal them. In other words, every line should come from a three-dimensional character, speaking true to their identity. Poor dialogue makes great plays unlikely.
Also, be selective with dialogue. Drama's essence lies in distillation,
Not replication. Never equate theatrical dialogue with real-life conversation. That covers most of the art of dramatic writing. Egri believed, no rules, no drama. Understanding dramatic mechanisms helps appreciate plays and inspires writing. Everyone has innate creativity, needing an outlet. If you love writing, pick up the pen, even if you won't be the next Shakespeare. Finding joy in writing makes life richer. That concludes our exploration of dramatic writing. Reading notes below the audio. Until next time.